Welcome back, Gadgeteers. It's another fine day outside. Okay, maybe not. It's actually very, very cold here in Michigan. And I have been told we're going to reach negative 30 degrees to negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill factor. So not looking forward to that. But I am glad to be home. As many of you know, I was in the hospital, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Today we're going to talk about the new system that I built. I actually ordered the parts before I ended up in the hospital, and 2 days after I got back I had so much anxiety I just went ahead and built it, and it really took my mind off things. So now we're going to talk about what parts I used when I put my new Ryzen 7 2700X system together, and then we're going to look at some benchmarks, and I'll give you my final opinion of the new system at the very end. So first off, let's talk about the parts that I put in the system. Now, the first and probably most important part is the motherboard. So I ended up using the MSI B450 Tomahawk motherboard. I got this board for, I believe it was $114. There were many other choices that I could have taken. I did get my brother-in-law the B450M. I think it's called the Pro Series or something like that. But it only has 2 memory slots in it. This particular motherboard has 4 memory slots in it, and currently I have 2 16 gigabyte DIMMs in there, but at some point I'm probably going to want to upgrade the memory and use it for editing and other things like that. So this board kind of fit the bill. There is a B350 that you can get for cheaper, which would probably be just fine, but I decided to get the newest one I could because I would like to upgrade to the Ryzen 3 or Zen 2 architecture in the future, and I'm thinking this board is more likely to get BIOS updates than older motherboards are. But I've heard MSI is pretty good about BIOS updates. I've used MSI boards in the past. I haven't really had to do BIOS updates, but I'm sure I would to support the new CPU architecture. Alright, we already talked about the processor. I did go ahead and buy the AMD Ryzen 7 2700X, and I decided I wanted the best processor that I could get aside from Threadripper. I wanted to build a Threadripper, but the fact is I just don't see a need for it in my case. You know, my use scenario is just not that heavy. I do shoot some 4K footage and I'm editing in 4K from time to time, but in reality the system I had, the Ryzen 7 1700, was good enough to do 4K, and the 2700X is even better. Next on the list is a power supply. I went with the EVGA Supernova 80 Plus Gold 850 watts of power because I wanted to make sure that the system had more than enough power. I have a suspicion my Dell Ryzen desktop that I had in here before, the tower, was possibly a little underpowered. I believe it has a 420 watt power supply in it. So I'm probably going to upgrade that one. I still have that computer, but I am thinking of selling it in the future. But we're going to use it to compare to this build. All right. Oh, I wanted to mention also with the Ryzen 7 processor, I did go ahead and use the stock cooler. I know. Don't say it. It won't do any good. It does good enough. I don't see any thermal throttling, but then again, you know, I don't overclock my parts. So that's one critical element, is I don't like to overclock my stuff. Okay, then for memory, I got the Vengeance LPX series. I got a dual kit, 2 by 16 gigabytes, and I bought the 3200 megahertz memory. I was very careful about getting this memory. I made sure it was on the list. Now, you have to check the versions too. When you take the memory out, of course, you can't see it anymore unless you take a picture, because there's a tag on the side of the memory that has the version number in it. I believe 5.30 and 5.31 was supported. It's really tricky because when you buy memory, say used on eBay, make sure you check the version number, because that's very important if you want to ramp this up. Now, version number 5.2, 5.3, and 5.31, I believe, supported 3200 megahertz. So you really have to check into this stuff before you make a purchase, because you don't want to be stuck with something that's running at 2133 by default, which is not good. The JEDEC default memory setting for this is 2133. Your board has to support XMP in order to get it up to 3200 megahertz, which this did, and it worked fine. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is the case. Now, ironically, we're recording here with my 4K webcam, so it's down on the floor here. Now, I do have some footage I'm going to cut in, or have already cut in, but I wanted to show you the case that I purchased. I went ahead with this particular case. Does it actually give a name? It says I purchased it. FSP ATX mid-tower PC computer gaming case with translucent side window panel. Ooh. So here's the thing about this particular case. It actually is very cool, and I do like it. What I like about this case is that it has a open grill on the front with 2 fans that come with it. It also has a fan in the back, and they all have LEDs, which I honestly don't care about, and I really don't care about the window. I think this whole, glow-in-the-dark LED thing is gonna, hopefully go away someday. I think it's just too gaudy. I'm more plain, if you will, with my PCs, but there was a reason I bought this particular case. For one thing, it had the 3 fans already installed, and they were quiet. Now, I did put an extra fan up here on the top to help vent heat from the 2 intake fans. So I have this one blowing out and this one blowing out, and of course the power supply down here. What I like about this case is it actually still has 2 5¼ inch bays. Now, I put a Blu-ray drive in one of those bays, and I still use it to view Blu-rays, and I do have some games that require the disc. So it is something I still use, and so it's harder than you realize to find a case that actually has these 5¼ bays. Now they're becoming somewhat passé. We're downloading the majority of our games these days, and same for other media content. You download it or you stream it. So I think probably in the future you can expect to not download anything, including your games, even on consoles. I really think that's going to be a thing in the future. I would even go so far as to say its processing power would be irrelevant, as most of it could take place, of course, on a server somewhere. The other thing I like about this is it's got 2 USB 3.0 right in front, 2 USB 2.0. At this point, I'm not sure why everything isn't simply USB 3.0. I don't get it. If you have some idea, let me know. It has an audio jack and a microphone jack on the front, which is very nice because I have a lavalier mic that I'll use much of the time. I believe that's a reset button, and not sure about that one, but this one, of course, is the power button. Now, on the back of the B450M Tomahawk motherboard, I have quite a bit of I/O here. Still have a PS2 port. I'm assuming this is a shared port, so you could plug in either a keyboard or a mouse. I believe this is honestly, I haven't checked in on it. It's either a power button or possibly something to be used to update the firmware with. I've got 2 USB 2.0 ports. I have a standard DVI out video port. I have 3 USB 3.1, and of course the old HDMI port. And I have here actually a USB-C port. Now, the audio jacks, of course, looking at it, supports probably subwoofer and rear speakers and all that fancy stuff, but I don't really do any of that. I have some very nice speakers down on the floor that I use that my wife got me, but I don't have any rear speakers or anything like that, and the subwoofers are built into the speakers, so they sound really nice. I also took out the 1 terabyte SSD that I have Linux installed on, and I have another 1 terabyte SSD, not a 1 terabyte actually, a 250 gigabyte SSD that I use for Windows, so they are on separate SSDs. I made the 4 terabyte HDD a NTFS partition, which I had done some time ago, and I use that for general data storage for both operating systems so that I can share files back and forth. The 1 terabyte is just a simple 2.5-inch SATA form factor, so it's not a really fast NVMe, which I could get, but as it is right now, it serves me very well, and I wanted more storage than I needed to have a very fast NVMe M.2 type drive, and that might possibly be something in the future I would consider along with a RAM upgrade if I find that it'll help me with video editing speeds. I do know when I went from 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes, the video editing in Kdenlive did speed up. It was marginal, maybe 10%, but it was something. And with 4K, I've noticed I use a lot more memory, so I might consider that. All right, so we've talked about the hardware, but what about the benchmarks? Now, the system that I had before this was a Dell 5675 Inspiron tower, gaming tower. It was their gaming PC, and it had in it a Ryzen 7 1700 and a Radeon RX 580 8 gigabyte video card. I did forget to mention that I took that Radeon 8 gigabyte video card, the RX 580, and put it in my new system. I bought an RX 570 for my old Dell Inspiron, and that works just fine if I actually need to game, which I don't. So let's have a look at the benchmarks. So interestingly enough, the Ryzen 7 2700 did do very well, but when I look at the Ryzen 7 1700, there was a difference of about 31% on multi-core and about 22.5% on single core. So that is a reasonable increase in speed. Part of that might be the motherboard that's in the Dell 5675. It may not be all that great, but it did have in it 32 gigabytes of 2666 megahertz memory. I actually have the box back here. In order to get the rated speed, the JEDEC minimum rated speed, I had to buy this kit of XPG memory for that unit, and this allows me to run it at 2666 megahertz. It will not go up to 3200 megahertz because the Dell motherboard does not support XMP at all. Now I have down here Bobo, my brother-in-law's computer. He has a Ryzen 5 2400G, which, as you know, has a built-in GPU as well as the CPU. He got a single core rating of 4054 and a multi-core of 11767, which is actually quite decent considering that this is an all-purpose, all-in-one processor. I had an i7 4790, which I'm going to do a video on. I have the footage, I just have to put it together. And I threw that in here for comparison. We've got a single core speed of 4464 and a multi-core of 14049. So here's what's strange. I ran Geekbench in Windows and in Linux, and I found quite astonishingly that I get way better performance in Geekbench as far as the processor goes than I do in, and this may not surprise you, Windows. So I saw an increase of about 10% with single core when I was in Linux and 18.5% increase with multi-core. I love that because, as you know, Kdenlive, yes, it can support rendering with your video card, but it takes a tremendous amount of work to get it working because there's multiple components that you have to compile. But I really do enjoy that I got that increase in Linux, and that says a lot for Linux and how it's utilizing the hardware, and something that you might want to consider. Cinebench scores. Well, looking at the GPU, I did get about a 29% increase in frame rates over the Ryzen 7 1700. Now, both of these systems were tested with the RX 580, and scores were reasonable. 117 1.5 frames versus 91. So not too bad. In comparison, the R5 2400G netted 39.46, and that is with two 16 gigabyte DIMMs running at 2800 megahertz. The i7 4790 Dell 9020, I threw that in here. That actually at the time had the RX 570 card in it, and it got 110.94. That's a 4th generation i7, and look how good it does with Cinebench, at least with the GPU. Now, Cinebench CPU scores, nothing overly surprising here. The Ryzen 7 again came in about 17.5% more than the Ryzen 7 1700 and the R5 2400G at 757. Now the i7 4790 once again came in at 761. Not too bad for a processor that's several generations older. As you know, I have a 4K render test that I always do with my systems, and this comprises a very precise 2-minute grouping of 4K files that I put together with audio. No filters, just straight render out to 4K from 4K. And I was very pleased to see that the 2700X did net me about 17% gain over the Ryzen 7 1700. Now this is time in seconds, 225 seconds. It doesn't sound like it's all that much, but when you're talking about rendering a file that may take an hour, shaving, 15 or so minutes off of that is actually pretty helpful. So yeah, I would say this is something that was worthwhile in that regard. All right, when it comes to video games, I only have benchmarked Witcher 2, and the reason is it runs in Linux, and I wanted to see what gaming would do in Linux for me, which is where I am the majority of the time. So I used Witcher 2 and I turned on ultra settings, and I was happy to see that with the Ryzen 7 1700 you can see the low of about 18, the high of about 38, an average of about 28 frames a second. With the Ryzen 7 2700X, I got about 10.5% faster performance. So the highs of 42 frames a second, low of 20 FPS, and an average of 31 FPS. This is Linux. Now, if I take that same game and run it in Windows, it actually runs a little bit faster. But first of all, I never use the ultra settings. I would use high or medium settings. When I run it in high, it does very, very well. I did benchmark it at least on the old Ryzen 7 1700, but it's been a while, so I didn't include that setting here. But you get an idea of what it can do with high settings with Witcher 2. And I feel fairly confident that this system is going to be fine playing games, especially since the video card came out of the Ryzen 7 1700, and it worked fine there as well. So what's the bottom line? Was this system worth building? I'm gonna have to go with not really. I know that when you watch the videos on YouTube of people building their 2700X systems, they're so excited about them and so excited to get the latest and the greatest. But if you already are on a Ryzen 7 platform, if you're on a Ryzen 5 or a Ryzen 7, the first generation, I don't really think there's a reason to upgrade. You will find that the change is evolutionary, not revolutionary. So you may end up being a little disappointed. I probably could have used my Ryzen 7 1700 desktop for another 2 or 3 years and it would have been perfectly fine, to be honest. I was hoping I would get better performance with video editing, but one thing I do notice is when I use the system, I do get pretty good overall performance. So there's way less stuttering in Kdenlive and everything is just more responsive and snappy. On the downside, the fan for the processor is much, much louder. That Dell 5675 was incredible. It was actually very, very, very quiet. Now, Here's the bad thing about it. It only has one small case fan in the back and the CPU fan. So I threw in a 120 millimeter fan and you couldn't even hear it. So it had maybe 25% of the loudness of this new 2700X build. So I got more performance, but the trade-off is a little bit more noise and really nothing else negative about it. I found that this new system is far more stable in Linux than the Dell Inspiron Tower was. I never had a problem running, benchmarking, testing, burning in the Dell 5675 while in Windows. But in Linux, it can be really flaky. Usually what I would do when I came up to use my Dell Inspiron is I would power off the plug bars and let the system sit there for about a minute and then power it back on, and it would work perfectly fine after that. Another problem with the Inspiron was that there was a setting in the BIOS I turned off called deep sleep. For whatever reason, I could never get it to wake up from Linux when it went into its so-called deep sleep, so I ended up having to power it off, which was very annoying. Now, I turned that setting off and that problem went away, so I'm really happy about that. So all in all, this system is much better. There were two other features in the Dell Inspiron that I missed. One was Bluetooth and the other was Wi-Fi. Now, I have a Wi-Fi dongle, so not really that big of a deal. However, my Wi-Fi dongle was much slower, so I had a friend bring me over a network cable, RJ45, and I plugged directly into my router, which is in the same room, so it works well for me. And I got my full download speed that I can get from my ISP and full upload speed, which is great. I'm reluctant to overclock. For one thing, you know, I'm doing air cooling with the stock cooler. Now, as long as there's no throttling, I'm good with that. I typically don't do overclocking. I don't know if anybody's been paying attention, but the 2080 Ti cards that have Micron memory are having significant burnout problems on the memory chips if you overclock the card, and it will then continue to have problems if you run it at the default clock rate. So there are some videos out there, you should check them out. If you're going to buy a used 2080 or a Ti, you need to know if that card was ever overclocked, because if it was, you may get a dud. If you can't test it or you're not allowed to return it if it's an eBay item, I would not buy it. But anyway, that's my main reason for overclocking. I need a stable system that runs well and runs fast, not the fastest system. So, yes, I really like the system, but I probably could have saved a few bucks and just kept the 1700 that I had, the Dell 5675. I'm going to pull up a spreadsheet here and show you what I paid for the system, and you tell me what you think. Now, a lot of these parts you might be able to find cheaper elsewhere, but let's have a look. The new items that I purchased was the Ryzen 7 2700X processor, the Tomahawk motherboard, the mid-tower gaming case, the EVGA power supply, and the RAM, all for a cost of $899.48, so about $900. Now, the other items that I already had were the Blu-ray drive for $50. I had bought the 1 terabyte SSD, and I already had put it into the Dell Ryzen. The Dell Ryzen 5675 system. So I just took that out and put it in the new computer. And the Seagate 4 terabyte green drive's actually a couple years old. I bought that some time ago for my data storage. And then the RX 580 video card I just borrowed from my other system, and I replaced it with an RX 570. So what I did here on the items that you're seeing right here, I just went ahead and totaled them up at the price I paid at the time and looked up an RX 580 video card that I could get and approximately what I would pay. So new stuff, $900. The stuff I already had, $552.65. So a grand total of $1,452.13. It's good that I had a bunch of stuff, and my computer's always evolved. I don't necessarily buy a whole new computer. I always upgrade my computers and add parts and components as I move along. The Dell Ryzen 5675 tower was a rare thing for me to just go out and buy, and I got that on sale for $949. Now, it did not have any SSDs in it, so I had to add an SSD. It came with a single 16 gigabyte DIMM, so I added the two 16 gigabyte DIMMs to bring it up to 32 gigabytes. So you have to factor all that in. So that's like another $200 for the memory and $200 for the 1 terabyte drive. So in reality, the pricing came out the same for this system as it did for the Dell Ryzen with the upgrades that I did. So I built computers all the time in the past. I really wish I had just went ahead and built my own computer again initially. I think I would have saved more money that way. On the other hand, I could have used that Dell Inspiron another year or two and got everything financially out of it I wanted to get out of it. So normally I do use these desktops for quite a long time. I had my AMD Phenom 2 X6 computer for at least 8-9 years, which was the 6-core processor, and I put 16 gigabytes of RAM in it, and I was using it with Kdenlive. And yes, it was slow, but it would do 1080p, no problem, fine. 4K, as long as you're patient and you don't mind waiting, it wasn't an issue. But, that system was long in the tooth, and this Ryzen 7 will serve me well for quite a while. And I can upgrade the processor when it comes out. The Dell Inspiron did not have any support for the Ryzen 2700 series or 2600, any of the Ryzen 2 series at all. So it's not like I could have upgraded the processor. So I originally was going to upgrade it to an 1800X, and I probably could have done that since I had the 32 gigs of memory, just bought an 1800X processor. But I got to thinking, geez, I bought this, I did actually buy one. I bought a Ryzen 7 1800X processor. I bought the new memory kit, the XPG, so I could get 2666 megahertz on the memory. And I thought, well, hold on here. Oh, and I bought the power supply as well because I was concerned that the power supply in the Dell Inspiron was causing problems. Thus, I was having those weird lockups and reboots and blue screens. Well, not a blue screen, but problems in Linux. And I had to power it off and wait a minute and power it back on. And then it would work fine. So I thought maybe it was the power supply. So I had the power supply. I had this memory, and I thought, I'm just going to return the 1800X, and all I need is a motherboard and CPU, and I can build a new computer. Of course, then I got thinking, but do I really want memory that is 2666 megahertz? And the answer to that was no. I want as fast as I can get within a reasonable price. So I bought the 3200 megahertz memory, and I'm glad I did. I think overall with the computer for $1,400, well, really $900 up front, I think the computer does very well. However, I could have went on with the Dell Inspiron for a very long time. It really didn't need an upgrade, and I didn't need to create a new computer. But I have it, and I like it, and I think that was worth it. And I had fun building it, so why not? Life's too short. All right. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you stuck around for the whole thing. If you did, like and subscribe. Consider becoming a Patreon supporter. I know some of you don't like Patreon anymore, and I do understand why. Hopefully they will get their head out of their you-know-what and things will get better. We'll see. But anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.